This is Outbreak News This Week, brought to you by the Global Dispatch Incorporated. Outbreak News This Week is your source for all the news about worms and germs. And now, your host, microbiologist and editor of OutbreakNewsToday.com. Here's Robert Harriman.
Well, hello, Tampa Bay. And I hope everybody had a very Merry Christmas. And as we wind down 2018, what we do at the website, OutbreakNewsToday.com, every year we do the top 10 most important infectious disease news stories of the year. And we'll be talking about that on the show. I'll talk about some honorable mentions, stories that I thought were pretty good, but they didn't quite make the cut, but deserve being talked about. In the second half of the show, I'm going to talk about, we're going to listen to the number one podcast for 2018. I did 133 podcasts in 2018, and the one that got the most downloads I'll be playing in the second half. And anyway, so it's going to be a year in review, basically, on the Outbreak News This Week radio show. And so let's go ahead and start and talk about some of these honorable mention stories, things that were pretty important, but didn't quite make the cut. Remember, this is all my opinion, so you may have different opinions, and that's okay. But I follow this stuff pretty closely, and this is what I came up with. So as an honorable mention, the syphilis situation in the United States and around the world for that matter, but in particular, in 2018, we learned that congenital syphilis, right? This syphilis transmitted from mother to baby had more than doubled from 2013 until 2017. Very, very, very tragic, right? And this is a very preventable condition. And what can happen is if a mother has syphilis and it infects the baby, you're talking about stillbirth and neonatal death and blindness and all kinds of really horrible, horrible things. Well, what the CDC told us back in September was that the reported cases jumped from, get this, 362 congenital syphilis cases in 2013 to 918 in 2017. And that's essentially the highest number of recorded cases in several decades. So it's very, very, very tragic. So I considered this a honorable mention story for 2018. Another honorable mention, which almost made the cut, was the acute flaccid myelitis situation in the United States this year. We've seen increases in the United Kingdom, in Canada, and the U.S. saw its highest number of confirmed cases since 2014. And as a matter of fact, since we're in the Tampa Bay area, just this past week, Florida reported their first confirmed acute flaccid myelitis case. And if you're not aware of what this is, it's a condition that affects the nervous system, especially around the area of the spinal cord, the gray matter, and it essentially causes these muscles and reflexes in the body to become weak. Well, the CDC, as of about a week ago, put the confirmed cases of AFM at 182 in 39 states. And that is easily the most cases we've seen since that first outbreak in 2014. So that's another honorable mention. Another honorable mention, and that covered the story pretty extensively on the website over the months, is the situation with the longhorn tick and the spread that we're seeing in the United States. Right, we've seen it in about 9 states right now, possibly 45 or 50 counties, and the longhorn, or the Asian longhorn tick, was first discovered here in 2017 in New Jersey, and it seems to be spreading across the country. what we do know is, in some parts of the world, the Asian longhorn tick is pretty common, and it's more of a serious threat to livestock. However, according to Ben Beard, he's a PhD deputy director of the CDC's Division of Vector-Borne Diseases. He says that the full public health and agricultural impact of this tick discovery and spread is still unknown. In other parts of the world, the Asian longhorn tick can transmit many types of pathogens common in the U.S. We are concerned that this tick, which can cause massive infestations on animals, on people, and in the environment, is spreading in the U.S. So that's another honorable mention story for 2018. So we saw chikungunya spread throughout the Western Hemisphere in 2013, 2014. A year or two later, we saw Zika do essentially the same thing. Well, one of my honorable mentions is the possibility of the spread of Mayo virus, right? That's another virus that's right now it produces some outbreaks down in South America and the Caribbean. And it's transmitted by some mosquito-borne virus. And Penn State did a study, about a month and a half ago, that discussed the concern that Mayo could be spreading in other parts of the world. And they've seen some imported cases in several areas of Europe. And so, yeah, this is something that we need to keep our eyes on because we've seen these mosquito-borne viruses do this damage in the past with other diseases. So we will be keeping an eye on that. And I make it as an honorable mention because of its potential. It does have some potential. And then a couple of unique stories, something you don't hear about every day. We reported over the summer of a teen in Wales who contracted cowpox. And this is the first time in over a decade that Wales had reported a cowpox infection. So just thought that was kind of interesting. You don't hear about that every day. And of course, if you don't know what cowpox is, it's essentially a viral dermatitis that you get from the cowpox virus. And usually people get it as lesions on their hands and maybe their arms and feet after feeding calves. So very interesting stuff. And you can find these stories, all of them, on OutbreakNewsToday.com. And the last honorable mention is a unique case report. Balamuthia mandrillaris. It's a free-living amoeba. It causes a real serious, life-threatening encephalitis in the brain. It's in the kind of the same family with Naegleria fowleri, right? The brain-eating amoeba. Well, there was there's only been a couple hundred cases diagnosed worldwide, so it's reasonably rare, and maybe a little over 100 cases right here in the U.S. in the past, 40 years. But there was a study that came out that was really, really interesting, and there's a podcast on this, and you can find that at Outbreak News Interviews about Balamuthia netipots and this unique case report where a lady was using a neti pot to clear her sinuses, and then she was having brain surgery about a year later, and they found this amoeba. And interesting story. I encourage you to check out the podcast. It's a really good one. Balamuthia netipots and a unique case report. Okay, what I want to jump into now are the Outbreak News Today 10 most important infectious disease stories of 2018. Right, and I've been doing this every year since 2013. And like I said, it's always a difficult task to do this, and everybody's got their opinion, and this is mine, and we'll run with it. So number 10 was the discovery of rat hepatitis E virus infection in 2 humans over in Hong Kong. And this is the first time in the world that the rat hepatitis E virus had been reported as causing a clinical infection in human beings. So why do I rank this in the top 10? Because this news should keep us constantly alert of the possibility of new zoonotic infections not seen before, right? Zoonotic, animal to humans. So I rank that number 10, the rat hepatitis E virus infections in 2 humans in Hong Kong. Number 9 was the increase of tick-borne diseases in the United States. And the CDC put out a report earlier this year. And they said that all tick-borne diseases, right, the whole range from Lyme disease to anaplasmosis, babesia, all the way to Powassan virus, all of them were up in 2017. To put it in perspective, there were about 49,000 total cases in 2016 of all these different diseases, tick-borne illnesses. And that was nearly 60,000 in 2017. So a pretty big jump. And if you remember back in 2013, the CDC finally came out and said that the estimated number of Lyme cases every year is about 10 times what they get as confirmed numbers. So back then it was about 30,000 a year. So they were saying we estimated about 300,000 Lyme cases annually. So if we take that math, the CDC estimated math, and there was 42,743 Lyme disease cases reported in 2017, that would equate to 427,430 estimated cases. So it's rising, and it's a big story, and it's something we're going to continue to see in the United States and elsewhere. And that's why that made number 9 on our 10 most important infectious disease stories of 2018. Now, number 8 was the outbreak of monkeypox in Nigeria this year. And possibly just as importantly, the report of 3 exported cases, right? 3 cases from Nigerian citizens who traveled to other countries, and people in that other country contracted it from, or it was reported, in a different country. For example, in these cases, there was 2 in the United Kingdom this year, and 1 in Israel. So that caught a lot of attention. But in Nigeria itself, I mean, we haven't seen this much coverage of monkeypox since, what year was that outbreak? 2003, when there was an outbreak here in the U.S. And Nigeria has seen, well over 100 confirmed cases in their current outbreak in the past, 13, 14 months. So, and not only that, other African countries have seen outbreaks also, like Cameroon and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So the fact that this virus appears to be seen more frequently in Africa, and the fact that it's crossing borders, crossing continents, is a concern to us, and that's why it made number 8 on today's program. Number 7, foodborne outbreaks. And I don't think I could turn on the news one day without hearing about this or that foodborne outbreak. And there was a lot of them. And I could actually bring up the list. But it ranged from everything from, what are we dealing with now, right? E. coli outbreaks due to romaine lettuce. We had salmonella outbreaks in Kellogg's Honey Smack cereal. Who would have thought? And then we saw so many cases of cyclospora, right? The parasite. I don't know, about 2,000 cases total linked to things like Del Monte vegetable trays and fresh express salads that were sold at McDonald's. But we just saw one outbreak of Vibrio outbreaks linked to food, and E. coli and Salmonella. It just went on and on throughout 2018. And that's why we put foodborne outbreaks at number 7. At number 6, and this was actually on the list last year, it was hepatitis A outbreaks really grew in the United States in 2018. And, since the middle of 2016, around that time, we started seeing some states, California, a few other ones, started declaring hepatitis A outbreaks. And the thing about them, it wasn't due to, hepatitis A is transmitted in a lot of ways. Foodborne and water is one of them. And these aren't linked to that. Instead, it appears that the transmission of the virus is through more direct person-to-person spread. A lot of it linked to homelessness. Illicit drug use those are some pretty important risk factors in these outbreaks. And just to give you a picture, I think it was just a couple days ago, I reported that Northeast Alabama is reporting increases in hepatitis A, right? A week or two ago, Louisiana became the latest state to declare an outbreak of Hep A. But here's a breakdown of some of the states that are experiencing outbreaks recently, right? Kentucky, over 3,000 cases, 21 people died. Michigan, 900 cases, 28 people died. Right. West Virginia, 2,000 plus cases, 12 deaths, and it goes on and on. And I got a list here of about a dozen states that have declared outbreaks, maybe even more. And us here in Florida, we have joined this list, and we've had over 400 cases of hepatitis A outbreak cases, right? These person-to-person spread linked to homelessness, illicit drug use. Some of it's men that have sex with men, all these types of risk factors. And a lot of these cases are really surrounding the Tampa Bay area and surrounding the Orlando area. But the numbers are really large. And I had it on last year's list because I didn't see it going away. I could only see it getting worse. And indeed it did. So that is why the hepatitis A outbreaks in the United States are number 6 on the top 10 most important infectious disease stories of 2018. A new entry into the top 10, and that's the African swine fever outbreak in China. All right. This is the only infection on here that doesn't infect people, but it has massive potential to cause economic damage. And we're starting to see some of that in China right now. Right. So though it can't infect you or I, it's, some strains of it are about 100% fatal in infected pigs. So like I said, in a place like China where, they produce, hundreds of thousands of pigs, maybe more, this can have economic burden on that place like never seen before. The African swine fever outbreak, was first seen in China ever this past August. And since then, it's been reported in about 24 different provinces all across the country. A lot of it's kind of in the southeast portions of the country, but you could still see an outbreak in, say, a southeast province and go 1,000 miles away to another province and they're having an outbreak. So it's spreading. It's causing a lot of pigs to be killed, to be culled. And back in September, if you may remember, they had a big meeting at the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization. And there, they had some dire things to say. For example, it was stated that African swine fever is here to stay. And that African swine fever in Asia is, quote, just the tip of the iceberg. So, and again, a lot of these topics I've interviewed experts on. I encourage you to check out a podcast I did with Stephen Higgs at Kansas State University about African swine fever in China and what is the risk to the United States. You can check that out at Outbreak News Interviews on the website, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, and on Spotify. Number 4. The number 4 most important infectious disease story of 2018, in my opinion, was the Nipah virus outbreak in India. Right? For the first time in India in 11 years, and essentially anywhere in the world since 2015, Nipah virus, a very, very lethal virus, reared its ugly head in Kerala State, India. The outbreak lasted, I don't know, a couple months or so, but in the end, there were a total of 19 Nipah virus cases, and 17 of them died. So, yeah, high case fatality rate. And I think India's seen 2 outbreaks, and the last one was in 2007. So, and the last world outbreak prior to this was Bangladesh. Well, Bangladesh was essentially having an outbreak almost every year up till about 2015. They haven't had one since, but that is the last outbreak seen in the world prior to this Nipah outbreak in Kerala State, India. All right. We're getting through the list. Number 3. And this was actually number 9 on my list last year. And I entitled it in 2017, The Measles Outbreak in Europe, as the 9th most important story of that year. And at that time, there was like 14,000 cases in Europe. And I'm sure the people in Europe are looking back, wishing that it could be like that again, because they got slammed this year with measles. And not only them, a lot of other places. And I'm going to talk about that. And it's always interesting when you put up these kind of lists, which are, right, I guess, educated opinion, right? And when I make the lists, I always try to look at, is this something that's going to drag on into the next year or go on a little bit farther? Or is this something that we're going to continue to see? And without a doubt, I knew that the measles outbreak in Europe in particular was going to continue and be an issue. Right? So I had at least one individual on Twitter comment saying it didn't really belong on the annual list. But, it's really easy to observe the anti-vaccine trend in Europe. So I stuck to my guns and believing that it would only get worse. And indeed it did. Okay, and now go ahead and continue that discussion on number 3, the measles and other vaccine-preventable diseases outbreaks going on in the world right now as the most important infectious disease news story of 2018. And again, please check out the website, outbreaknewstoday.com, outbreaknewstoday.com. Check out the podcast, Outbreak News Interviews, on the website, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, and Spotify. And after the break, we'll continue the list and we'll look at the number 1 podcast of the year. See you then.
Outbreak News This Week, your source for all the news about worms and germs. Here's your host, microbiologist and editor of OutbreakNewsToday.com, Robert Harriman.
Well, welcome back to the program, and I'm glad you could join me, and we're continuing our year in review, our look back on 2018 and the 10 most important infectious disease stories of 2018, according to me and the website Outbreak News Today. And I was on number 3 before the break and talking about the measles outbreak, and I ranked number 3 the measles and other vaccine preventable diseases outbreaks, and that is what we're seeing, right? So last year, Europe in 2017 saw 14,000 cases, and that was a huge deal, right? Well, let's turn the clock to 2018. And just in the first 6 months of the year, Europe saw more than 40,000 cases from January to June. All right, huge. Don't know what the final tally for the year is yet, but I'm sure we're going to be in for a pretty large number. Ukraine is a country we've been following very close on the website, and Ukraine alone has reported some 50,000 cases in 2018. Huge story. And some people will say, well, they're vaccinated. No, there's a lot of very low vaccination rate in Ukraine, and they're trying to fix it, but yeah, it is very low. And not only Europe, though, right? We saw quite a few cases here in the United States, a couple hundred or so. But look at South America, right? Venezuela, right? Brazil has seen thousands of cases, most of them from Venezuela. So that's become a very big problem there. And other neighboring South American countries are getting hit a little bit also. If we turn our attention to Africa, just in the past 3 months, Madagascar has seen about 10,000 cases in just this very short period of time. I saw that, right? The Philippines saw a big boost in measles cases this year. Vaccine rates are down, and a lot of that has to do with people's concern about vaccines due to the Dengvaxia issue in the Philippines in recent years. So, yeah, Thailand, southern Thailand has an outbreak going on, right? 5,000 or so cases. And a lot of that is linked to religious objections to taking the vaccine, right? There's a large Muslim population there, and what they're seeing is because there's a gelatin that's used, so it's a pork product apparently in the vaccine. A lot of the Muslims won't take it, even though the mosque there, the religious leaders say it's okay. Look at Israel. Israel's seen over, 2,500 cases. Jerusalem's been hit with nearly 1,000. So, and that has affected the United States, right? Right. We've seen imported cases from Israel up in Brooklyn and in New York and New Jersey. So it stuff spreads like wildfire. So yeah. So that's what. And again, I don't see this going away. So I suspect you're going to see this, at least the measles portion, back on the list in 2019. I hope I'm wrong, but I mean, we just the world in general, and a lot of these countries specifically, have very, very strong anti-vaccine movements going on, and we're seeing that right here in the United States, right? Down in Texas, some of you may know who Dr. Peter Hotez is, right? He's an infectious disease expert, and he's a great force against neglected tropical diseases and a great force against vaccine preventable diseases. And he has an autistic child. But he is, if you go on Twitter, this man is slammed by the anti-vaccine movement all the time. And sometimes it gets vicious. So yeah, it's a very powerful movement, and and it's really disheartening. It's disheartening when you see some of these politicians come out and say unfactual things, silly things. I kind of expect it out of some of these celebrities, and hopefully you're not listening to celebrities for your medical advice, but yeah. So anyway, well, in addition to measles, there's other vaccine preventable outbreaks being reported across the globe. And just to give you a couple examples, in Venezuela, we're seeing a mounting of diphtheria cases. And look over in Japan, rubella, right? German measles. They're seeing this large outbreak over there because in middle-aged men too. That's really weird. But I guess back in the day, they were only vaccinating the girls for rubella. So, right, and there's a good reason for that. But they weren't vaccinating the boys, and now all these boys are middle-aged men, 40 to mid-50s, and they're coming down with rubella. So Japan is trying to tackle that. Okay, let me speed this along a little bit. Number 2, Venezuela. And of course, last year, the health crisis in Venezuela was number 3 on my list. And due to a plethora of infectious diseases and health and outbreak situations, it's only going to continue to get worse as time goes by. So Venezuela got boosted up to number 2 in 2018. And drum roll, please. Number 1. The number 1 most important infectious disease story of 2018 is the Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Not a big surprise. Not a big surprise, right? DRC had 2 outbreaks this year. One earlier in the summer, they had, 28 some odd cases. But the current outbreak, which started like a week later, right now is the second largest outbreak ever seen, other than the 2014-2016 outbreak in West Africa. So they've seen, some, 580 cases as of today, I think, and about 300 deaths. So it's a real big deal for a lot of reasons because there's a lot of craziness going on in that part of Democratic Republic of Congo. There's armed militias and there's lots of violence. And right now there's elections going on. And there was a story out today saying that 24 patients fled an Ebola treatment center in DRC after protesters ransacked the facility as part of ongoing demonstrations against the upcoming presidential election. So there's just chaos everywhere. And this is going to make this outbreak drag on much longer than it should. So, prayer for these people out there because they're just totally going through all kinds of suffering. Okay. And that's the top 10 most important infectious disease news stories of 2018. Now, I do a podcast, Outbreak News Interviews, and 133 podcasts this year. And the number 1 podcast of the year was entitled, as far as downloads, "The Flu Pandemic Clock is Ticking. Are We Ready?" And this was an interview with CIDRAP director Michael Osterholm, PhD. And he explains why he thinks we are woefully unprepared for the coming flu pandemic. So I'm going to go ahead and share that audio with you now, the number 1 podcast of the year on Outbreak News Interviews. Now, many experts say a flu pandemic is clearly on the horizon. So the question is, are we ready for a flu pandemic? Now, my guest today says, well, not so much, as he outlined in a New York Times op-ed earlier this week. Joining me now is Michael Osterholm, PhD. Dr. Osterholm is the director of CIDRAP at the University of Minnesota. Dr. Osterholm, welcome back to the show, sir.
Thank you, Robert.
Okay, so you titled the op-ed, "We're Not Ready for a Flu Pandemic," and I'll link to it in the show notes if people want to check it out. Dr. Osterholm, why are you so sure that a flu pandemic is in our near or our distant future?
Well, first of all, influenza as an infectious agent goes back almost to antiquity. It surely was around many, many thousands of years ago in avian species, birds, and with some infection of mammals. But clearly, since we've had more modern history, meaning dating back even 1,000 years, influenza pandemics have occurred every so many years, sometimes several decades, sometimes as frequently as once every 10 years. And if you go back through the history books, you can see that while we surely dealt with plague and we dealt with cholera and other kinds of outbreaks like that, influenza pandemics were a part of that. And of course, that occurs when a new influenza virus makes its way out of the bird population, either through another animal species or to humans, and there's a sufficient number of genetic changes in the virus so that when a human actually becomes infected, the virus will actually enter their lung cells, and then more specifically, additional changes occur so that they then can transmit that virus to other humans. And it's when that new bird virus now is readily transmitted between people that we see a new pandemic emerge.
Yeah, and in the article, you focus a lot of attention on the issue of vaccines. So, Dr. Osterholm, how are we lacking, and what needs to be done?
Well, first of all, one has to understand the history of influenza vaccines, and we actually provided a very detailed description of that in a report that our center at CIDRAP, the Center for Infectious Research and Policy, did in 2011, where we actually talked about why influenza vaccines ever came to light. And it turns out that the 1918 epidemic, the anniversary, of course, for 100 years is this year, really weighed heavy on the minds of those who were fighting World War II. And they remembered that, in fact, there were 10 times as many deaths in 1918, 1919 due to the pandemic flu than there was all the battlefield casualties combined. And so that at that point they thought, what happens if we have another crowded environment kind of situation with war, and what happens if another flu pandemic emerges? So at that time, the Department of War in the United States was really the lead agency and put together a tremendous effort to try to come up with a vaccine that could be given to soldiers. And they hit upon what they thought were two very key antigens, a hemagglutinin and neuraminidase. And remember, this is in the early days, really, of virology as such, and developed this new vaccine. And for many, many years, people just assumed that that vaccine is developed and grown in chicken eggs was a highly effective vaccine. And in fact, our paper in 2009 in Lancet, which at the time was not a very popular paper, called that into question and said, based on our new analysis, if we look back at those old studies, they grossly overestimated how well these vaccines worked. And at that point, then, we understood that we did have problems. Today, it's a given. People realize the problems with our current influenza vaccines and the fact that we need them. And unfortunately, what I talked about in this op-ed piece in the New York Times was the fact that there really hasn't been the kind of investment in new influenza vaccine work that we desperately need to have effective vaccines, not just for seasonal flu, but also for a pandemic.
So is this part of the reason you point to the current Trump administration as part of the problem? Can you explain that?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me take a step back and say it's not just the Trump administration. I mean, if you look back, we've not had a major initiative on influenza vaccines dating back decades. Now, recognizing that, in fact, it was really only in the 2009-10 time period that people began to understand the inferior performance of the current influenza vaccines. However, we did know, even before then, and it was true in 2009 with the H1N1 pandemic, that the way we make influenza vaccine through largely growing it in chicken eggs, and it takes months to do that in each of the previous pandemics that occurred during the vaccine era, meaning 1957, 1968, and then subsequently in 2009, in each case, the pandemic had largely passed before the first doses of vaccine were ever available. And so not only the question is, did it work, but could it be available? And so it was really around 2009 and 10 we began to understand the nature of our challenges with influenza. But since that time, no government, including the United States, not just the United States, no other organization, including the World Health Organization, others have really identified the critical need for what we call universal or new game-changing flu vaccines. And that's a real challenge for us because today it's going to take a Manhattan-like project. One of the things I commented on in our op-ed piece is this year the United States government, which is just one entity, I might add, not the only one, it should be supporting this, is providing about $70 million in support for new universal flu vaccine research, whereas, the world is putting in $1 billion again this year for HIV vaccine research, which I think is very important, and it has been doing that for years. Why do we not put a similar investment into the flu vaccine area where we desperately need new flu vaccines? And there is some initial science that says we can actually find them.
Now, the next question I found pretty troubling, and I would venture to guess that most of the public is not even aware of this. And you say that U.S. hospitals are woefully unprepared and supply shortages are a danger. Now, Dr. Osterholm, this is America. Why would we run out of supplies in a pandemic?
Well, it's interesting you say that. Just this morning I was reviewing the Emergency Medical Systems drug shortage list, which is a list kept by a group of EMS experts. And there are 54 drugs right now on major shortage or absolutely not available lists. The problem we have today is the business of healthcare is just like business. And what I mean by that is today no one goes and gets an MBA at any kind of business school to talk about how to add more complicated aspects to the supply chain. It's all about simplifying it. It's just-in-time delivery. We don't have warehouses anymore. They largely are on ships, of anything, transporting goods from Asia to the United States. And so if you look, for example, today, most of the critical drugs that we use in this country actually are made in India and China. And there's, in most cases, no stockpiles of any kind. It's just-in-time delivery. And one of the points that we've made over and over again is in this kind of situation, you don't even need a major pandemic to have a problem. Look what's happening right now with saline bags from Puerto Rico, which happened to be a place where most of the saline bags in the world were made. One hurricane basically has caused major global shortages. We can see around the country today, if you read the headlines, there are hospitals in California, elsewhere, that are just having major drug shortages because, again, the system of international production, international global movement of those products is such that it's just-in-time delivery. So now put that on top of a overall preparedness for a pandemic where the whole world is going to be needing all these supplies at one time. And we're going to have major shortages. And that's why I have been critical, for example, of activities like the World Bank's activities to create a pandemic fund, where at the time of the next influenza pandemic or global situation like that, they're going to loan these countries around the world that don't have the money to buy these goods. Well, there won't be any goods to buy. In 2009, when the H1N1 pandemic occurred, one of the major master respirator companies in the world got over 4 years' worth of orders in 1 week, for which they obviously were never going to fill the vast majority of those because they just didn't have the capacity. So one of the things we have to understand when we prepare for a pandemic is this global impact on manufacturing, trade, and travel. And that is going to overwhelm very quickly into the healthcare system in such a way that the collateral damage from a severe pandemic could be every bit as bad as the actual infectious agent causing the pandemic, like flu. And that's why we have to be better prepared to not have that happen.
Now, is anybody listening to these things that you're saying?
I think a lot of people are listening. But, I look at, for example, when the World Health Organization put together its very important R&D roadmap agenda for vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics, which now we have a series of very important infectious diseases for which we're trying to develop the criteria, the background, the reasons for why we need these vaccines and therapeutics and diagnostics. Influenza was left off. When the Coalition of Preparedness Innovation, CIPI, came into being, influenza was left off. People have just made the assumption that somebody else is doing it. The private sector says it's the government's job. Government says, well, the private sector philanthropy has to do it. And part of the problem is no one is doing it. And I give credit to the NIH. Tony Fauci and colleagues are surely making this a very important point from the standpoint of publicly identifying it as a critical issue. Yet when you look at the resources they have available to them today, $30 million roughly for this year. When you look at the overall budget of the NIH, that's just a very, very, very small percentage of the NIH budget. If this is really such a major and critical public health issue, why are we not investing much more into this? And to me, that's a really major part of the message of our op-ed piece. We should be.
Right. Now, lastly, what do you see? I don't want to scare the audience any more than I have, but what do you see as the worst case scenario?
Well, it's interesting, Robert, because as we've talked before in this program, in our book, Deadliest Enemies, Our War Against Killer Germs, that Mark Holshaker and I published last year, we actually laid out a very detailed scenario of what an emerging influenza pandemic like one caused by H7N9, the current strain of flu that we worry about in China, which is infecting humans from chickens. Fortunately, it has not yet been a virus that's changed enough so that humans transmit it to other humans. But about a third of the people who are being exposed to these bird viruses who become infected die. This is a very serious situation, and there's been a number of people who have tried to say to the world, wake up, this could be the next pandemic tomorrow. The pandemic clock is ticking. We just don't know what time it is. And so I think that should one of these agents, like H7N9, become the next pandemic strain of influenza, which there will be one, this could be a real catastrophic event. And, we forget that in 1918, where 52 million people were killed by this virus, and at a time when the world is 1/4 the population it is today. And the fact that they died largely not from secondary bacterial pneumonias, as has been reported by some, but we have increasing evidence that cytokine storms or immune system dysfunction was the primary reason for so many of the deaths. So that means that even having antibiotics today is not going to change that picture. This could be a really serious issue. And so I think that's what we're up against today.
All right. Well, I want to encourage listeners to also check out his book, Dr. Osterholm's book, Deadliest Enemy, Our War Against Killer Germs. And I'll link to that in the show notes also. Dr. Mike Osterholm, thanks again for your time and expertise. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks, Robert. It's always great to do these with you, and I appreciate the public service you provide in doing this kind of work. You really are, by yourself, a very unique gift to all of us in public health.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Take care of yourself, sir.
Thank you.
All right. Continuing on our year in review at the Outbreak News This Week radio show and the OutbreakNewsToday.com website, I also looked back to see on the website what was the number one post, the number one article, number one story of the year as far as traffic, how many hits. And it turns out it was actually a recent story. It came out in early December, and it was concerning researchers at Johns Hopkins that were doing a study on using oils, essential oils from garlic and some other herbs and plants, and testing their activity against Borrelia burgdorferi, the bacterial cause of Lyme disease. And this was our number one, traffic-wise, number one story of the year. And as a matter of fact, if you do want to check out the podcast, I did talk to the senior author of the study, Dr. Ying Zhang, and you can find that podcast at Outbreak News Interviews. But so that was our number one story concerning as far as traffic goes. And that just got published about 3.5 weeks ago. So it really went off the charts. Very interesting stuff, though. I encourage you to check that out. Check out the interview also. Okay. And that's essentially it for our year in review. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you appreciate my opinions. And if you don't, send me an email, outbreaknews1@gmail.com. And I'd love to chat with you about it. Big story this week is Sanofi just got approval from the FDA with a new pediatric hexavalent combination vaccine called Vaxelis. And that's fantastic news. It'll offer protection against 6 different infectious agents, so good stuff there. And I want to thank you for listening this year. I appreciate it. And I hope you have a happy new year, and I will see you next year on Outbreak News This Week. Good day, and God bless.
Thank you for listening to Outbreak News This Week with Robert Harriman. If you missed any part of today's program, you can listen to the podcast anytime on our website, OutbreakNewsToday.com. Make sure to join us here next week for Outbreak News This Week with Robert Harriman.